So one of the things that I wanted to actually go through is today, when we wake up in the morning, when we wake up in the morning, I think even before we open our eyes, we touch something called this. I think this particular device probably receives more tender loving care than our spouse or our children. Probably the dog maybe come second after this. So this is how technology has impacted our life. My wife has so many times told me that, I think if you don't have this phone, you might be dead. But you will not miss me as much as you miss this phone. So I said, it's a very tough question you're posing. But anyway, luckily for me, she's not here today. So I can say this boldly. So today, if you were to look at it, I want the next slide to come. Oh, I have to do it myself. Thank you. If you look at the morning, as soon as you wake up, like I said, you first look at this. But you look at every part of your life, there is technology impacting you. You start, if you look at, you look at your WhatsApp, there is telecommunication technology. Then if you go into you take your slippers, there's new kinds of footwear with new materials. You go into the toilet, I don't want to talk about Arvind Kejriwal, but today there are smart toilets who tell you everything that's wrong with you. If you go into your car later on, the car is today perhaps more intelligent than you are. Then you touch your laptop. The laptop tells you things that, even your wife probably can't tell you. So you have all kinds of technologies all over the place. Now there are various things that are affecting us without our knowledge. If you take the home today, the home is pretty revolutionary in many ways. Today, when I go to shops, hardware shops, I was in Asian Paints many years ago. But today, if I look at the home today and compared to 30, 40 years ago, a home today can be remarkable. I've seen smart locks. I'm very scared of these smart locks, because I do not know how to open them. And many times I had this problem once with the smart access cards, with this finger thing. My fingerprint got spoiled. So for about 3-4 months, I actually couldn't use that fingerprint lock. Now you're a little worried when you go out with these smart homes. You don't know whether you'll be locked out from your own home. So you see these homes, they're very, very intelligent, sometimes too super intelligent. There are also many things that you don't know about. For example, you'll wonder why the fuss that people made when India went into space. But then you find out, when you look at it, that space tech has multiple impacts in all parts of your life. The clothes you wear, even the writing instruments, the kind of cars you drive. You look at even things like building turbines. You look at communication. You look at weather forecasting, climate change predictions. You look at even food processing, alarms. Almost every aspect of your life, space technology has an impact. So when we talk today about technology or technology innovations, it's not just that it's space and you can forget about it. Now you can understand why other countries didn't want India to be a leader or to become really prominent in space, because of the kind of impact it has on so many other fields. So that's the important point, that when you look at even nuclear, like what Ramkumar talked about, I think Oppenheimer had a very great vision for nuclear, that it will help in nuclear medicine. He didn't realize that the bigger impact would be on the bomb. But that's what he thought, So it's fascinating to see the impact that technology has on our lives. And then you look at the kind of innovations that have happened over the years, right from, of course, the fire, the first thing, then the wheel, which even today, a lot of people don't know that many things are developed because of the fact that horses could only go with a certain width. So even your railway track became that certain width, and therefore a lot of products today are designed with that width in mind. So things that were designed many years ago even continue to have an impact today. You see a lot of the innovations that have happened, there are so many things. We don't know what else can happen. But what is more fascinating than these innovations is also the pace of innovation, as also the impact on productivity. I was very surprised to see that from 1760 to now, there has been a 30 times increase in our human productivity overall, because of these various innovations. And this slide from Business Insider tells you that the output per hour, how it has galloped from the time of 1760 till now. It's tremendous. But what is more interesting is also this, that if you take the time to reach mass adoption, which is 25% of the target segment, you will find that it is rapidly reduced. What took 68 years for aeroplanes took Pokemon Go only 19 days, but Arogya Setu beat it in 13 days. And now ChatGPT, in just about 2 months, has touched, when it launched last year, 100 million plus, and it's even more. So what you're seeing is not just the kind of innovations that are developing, but the pace at which these innovations are also being accepted and being used. What we have today, therefore, is a speaker who can help us understand what is happening with these innovations, what the future holds, how to navigate all of this. Now, one of the things I found when I was going through this for this today's session is a very interesting McKinsey report. And what is it that all of us in this room can consider doing? Mahesh, during his conversation with me, will talk about frameworks towards the end of the conversation. But this is something that I think people need to keep in mind, which is what's the kind of impact that it can have, the scale, the kind of maturity that the organization is at. And number 3 is how does it fit in with the organization? It also impacts individuals. Like when I joined, I don't know how many of you know, if I tell you some of the things, you'll understand how old I am. Because when I started teaching first, you had something called the cyclostyle. You had something called the overhead projector. Today, all that is a thing of the past. Many people, if I show those products, many people in this room may not understand what those products are. But you know how presentation technologies itself have evolved, though the content may not have changed. With that in mind, I will now ask us to think through, along with Mahesh, and let us start navigating the future. Over to you, Mahesh, for this conversation. Thank you very much. I just wanted to set a context.
Good evening. Thank you, Chandu, for so nicely setting the context. I think the context was set so nicely that I could actually continue from what Chandu started to elaborate on. It is the pace of change and the velocity of change and how big the change is happening. So as Chandu rightly pointed out, we need to look at the past to know the future. So let me actually share some initial thoughts of some of the points that Chandu was articulating. If you look at this slide, it was advised to the lawyer of Henry Ford that he should not invest in Ford Motor Company because the horse is here to stay, but automobile is only a novelty. Later on, it so happened that $5,000 invested by the lawyer became $12.5 million. The point I'm trying to articulate is, how do you know whether a new technology or a product or service that is being introduced is a fad, or is it going to stay, or is it going to be changing the industry itself? And it was also mentioned, interestingly, about one particular thing. We tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run. The short run means somewhere around the 5-year or less, and the long run is more than that. What it happens is when a new technology emerges, there is often a hype around that technology and its potential. Take, for example, the AI. Initially, just after the release of the AI chatbots like ChatGPT, we had a very big kind of, I would say, euphoria, and Gartner calls it as the hype cycle. Some of you may have actually seen it. And what it means is the initial euphoria fades down, and then eventually it became what is called as the disappointment, and then it goes on to a plateau of productivity. And we need to understand when a technology gets introduced, what kind of hype it creates, and there is a disillusionment, and then a plateau of productivity. And any prediction about the future is uncertain, and that's one thing that we can be certain about. Moving forward, one thing which I want to mention is also the context in which we are trying to understand. I think it was also mentioned by Group Captain that the best way to predict the future is to invent it, and it was mentioned by Alan Kay. Let's start with a framework to understand how do we make sense of all the technology that is happening. And Chandu correctly pointed out the time it took for certain technologies. He started from the 5000 BC, but let's start with the electricity, 46 years to reach 50 million users, telephone 25 years, smartphone under a decade, ChatGPT was much, much shorter, and for millions of users, it took only days. As leaders, we need to understand that this pace of change is rapidly shortening because of the digital adoption of technology. And we need to understand what is changing, and early adoption is no longer a luxury. If we wait too long, we might miss it out, or we may need to do the catch-up game. But how do we know which technology to adopt, which technology becomes a fad? And so let us understand the context in which we are operating and the technologies that are there and what could actually succeed, what could actually fail. And some companies that I would like Chandu to post me the question, and then I would actually take up some of the examples of companies that failed to adapt.
So before we jump into the companies that failed to adapt, I think given the pace of innovation that's happening and the kind of rapidity at which they're being adopted by people, what can leaders and professionals in this room or anywhere figure out a framework in which to look at these tech innovations? What are the approach that they need to take in order to make sense of what's happening?
It's a very important question. So how do I use a framework to know the way in which to identify the technology adoption and how to make sense of these technologies and make a clear adoption strategy or clear way in which we dismiss that technology as a fad? In order to do that, we need to actually look at some of the examples of what larger companies have actually done when it comes to adoption of technologies. For example, if you take the most important recent phenomena like the AI, there are larger companies, there are middle sector companies, there are smaller companies. Some of these companies that are adopting the AI technology are doing it consistently and are able to identify a use case. That means essentially we start with a strategic fit for the business. If it doesn't actually make sense for your business, it doesn't make sense to start adopting it. That's number one. Number two is if we are actually looking at the way in which the technology is evolving, has there been multiple iterations of this technology, or is it still in the infancy stage? And if you see a lot of interesting innovations, funding happening in a particular technology, and a lot of learned people, scientists, universities are putting a lot of R&D behind it, that means that technology is there to stay. And then the next thing is, if this technology is actually providing you a new business model, then it means that you need to consistently look at the process that you are going to adopt in order to change or adopt the new technology. And there will be some more examples as we speak. So there are a few steps in which we can actually say that a company can prepare itself to identify, and it's a framework for adopting a technology. There are more such frameworks which I will touch upon later in the presentation today.
Now, Mahesh, there are a lot of smart people all over the world. There are a lot of smart people in this room who worked in large companies. But I've also seen that these smart people in large companies end up looking very dumb, right? And you'll find so many cases of what should I call egregious failures. Like you wanted to talk about companies that fail to adopt. There are so many companies who are household names. You know, even in India, when I was a kid, there was something called a Dunlop pillow. Now that neither the tire is there nor the pillow is there. So the company has kind of retired. So can you walk us through why these kind of supposedly smart people in these supposedly well-run companies fail to adopt? And can you give us some examples to illustrate what happened?
That's a great question, Chandu. One of the challenges for great people is to accept that there is a disruption that is happening in the industry. I was just about to start with the case of Kodak. What happened in the case of Kodak, ironically, is that Kodak was once the dominant player in the photography industry, inventing the first digital camera in 1975. However, the people at the helm of affairs, very smart people, as Chandu would say, are very strong people in chemical technology and in film technology. And when they actually looked at the digital photography, they didn't give the importance it deserved because they saw that eating or cannibalizing their core business. So here comes the challenge. I am doing a business. I am very competent at this, and there is a new technology that is coming up, and it's in its infancy. It is not yet proven itself. Do I actually give out my core competence and try out the new technology, or do I continue to hold my fort and say, I am good at this and I will continue to be good at this, and what is coming up is not going to change? So the very smart people who are instrumental in the success of that company, because of their success and their historical evidence, they fail to spot the new emerging technology that is going to make this change.
So actually, when we discussed it, you mentioned quite a few examples. Like you talked about, I think, Kodak, which 100-plus-year-old company which died. You talked about, I think, Blockbuster. You talked about, I think, Toys R Us. You talked about Nokia. So I think it's important for some of these people to, for the audience to understand what happens that companies can't discern the trend, number one. Number two, as a follow-up question, many times we are also very confused. What is a trend which is lasting? What is a fad? Okay, because very tough to make out. Sometimes when you first look at it, should I spend money on it? For example, we are all investors. We have all invested, for example, in SaaS companies. Now AI has come. Now SaaS companies are facing a challenge. How do I bring in AI, or should I create a completely new product which is AI first? So what exactly is it that you would give examples of technologies that actually turned out to be fads, and how does a professional or a company discern the difference between the two?
Absolutely, Chandu. I think it's another important question. First, I'll start with some of the examples that Chandu started with, and then I will actually talk about the other part of the question. So we talked about Kodak and how it missed the digital camera. Most of you may not remember, but some of you may. There was a company called Blockbuster. It was in the video rental service. And if you have lived in US or UK or other parts of the world, you would have seen that they have this physical shop with the video rental, with the VHS tapes, later on with the DVDs that were actually rented out. And interestingly, when Netflix started, it also started with the same kind of concept. And the video streaming was not that powerful then, but Netflix started to adopt this. And interestingly, Blockbuster had an opportunity to buy out Netflix for 50 million, but they did not choose to do so because they thought at that time the video streaming is not going to be real and it's not going to take off. But eventually it happened that Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy in 2010, and we know where Netflix is. Let's take another great example of Nokia. I was a big Nokia fan once, and I think most of us would have actually used Nokia. And before 2010, it was one of the most popular mobile phones we had. What Nokia missed out is the significance of smartphone and touchscreen technology. It focused instead of the feature phone. When Apple introduced the iPhone and later the Android followed soon, Nokia's market share plummeted. The company was eventually sold to Microsoft in 2014. And BlackBerry also failed to transition to touchscreen, and it was synonymous with the business phone. Most of us read our email in a BlackBerry, and like Nokia, BlackBerry was slow to adapt, and it was one of the greatest company from Canada, but it also stopped its movement into new technology and lost its relevance. Interestingly, another company that we should know of is the Xerox. The GUI, or the graphical user interface, was invented in the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. They also actually invented Ethernet. They also invented things like the mouse. They have been extremely good in research, but they have not been able to commercialize most of it. There were a lot of companies that actually took those ideas and commercialized it. Then we have another great example of Yahoo. They missed the search engine and the social media revolution because it was once a very dominant search engine and listing directory. When Google became the leader, they had not been able to overcome the algorithm that Google had. Additionally, Yahoo had the chance to acquire both Google and Facebook in their early days, but passed the opportunities. As a result, eventually Yahoo got sold to Verizon in 2017. Polaroid is another example that missed the digital photography. Sears is another great brand that was very prominent in US. It was one of the largest retailer, but failed to adapt to the changing consumer preference and online commerce. MySpace, if you are old enough to remember, was the precursor for the social media. It also failed to compete as Facebook grew. Its simpler user interface and adoption was much more powerful. Then we have more examples of Toys R Us, which had brick and mortar stores. One of the difficult decisions they had to take was to give their online retailing to Amazon, which cannibalized that company, and it filed for bankruptcy. Now, it's interesting to see that great companies like this had the opportunity to pivot, did not pivot for whatever reason, and that's the next thing that we are actually going to see. And I will just touch upon one more topic because it's easy to see some of the great technologies, but it's important to understand that not all great technologies are going to be adopted, because let's take a look at, for example, the 3D television. In fact, in 2010, it was actually quite popular. Sony, Samsung, many other companies introduced the 3D television. The hype was that it is going to be the way that the television will be watched. They actually had the 3D glasses, but the reality is there was no 3D content that was available. And finally, this thing fizzled out. Another example is the Google Glass, which had a big hype that is going to change the way that we are going to use the internet. It had the voice search capability. The glass had the display to see the answers that was asked, questions that were asked were answered through this. The reality was it faced privacy concerns, and the cost was about $1,500. It fizzled out. It had a minimal application in the industrial usage, but never gained consumer adoption. And there is one interesting thing that had come up called mini disc. When things moved from VHS to the model kind of in the disc shape, the CD was popular, but the CD had the opportunity to get the songs recorded. Then we had the ability to stream it as an MP3, but in between the songs were actually distributed through mini disc. But the reality was that it never caught up because the cost and the rise of MP3 players, iPod, etc., made it irrelevant. And the other one which I want to just touch upon is Segway. You might have actually seen in some of the movies. It was supposed to have actually changed the urban mobility, and it was supposed to have replacement for cars for short distances. But the reality was it didn't take off because of the expense impractical, and safety concerns. And the final situation is the Segway ended and closed the factory in 2020. The other one I think most of you may not have seen this is called the Second Life. It is the precursor to the interesting concept that erstwhile Facebook started called Meta. Meta is the metaverse or alternate universe that was supposed to have actually taken us to a virtual world. And many of this hype didn't exist today because the examples were interesting, but that's not the world that the mass consumer wanted to adopt. And this is an example of many technologies that were actually coming to disrupt the existing people. Then there were actually technologies that actually failed or fizzled out. Now, the question that Chandu will naturally ask is, how do I know which technology to adopt, which technology is going to be fizzling out? And this is something in particular I will go in a greater detail at a later stage. But what is important is for us to keep an eye on what's happening in the market. And let me just allow Chandu to ask the next question and come back to this.
Okay, now one of the things that Ram and I were just talking is, okay, there are companies who didn't adopt, like you said. But there are also equally, I'll just probably touch upon a couple of them. If you look at Microsoft or you look at Amazon, Amazon started off as an online bookseller. Today, if I were to ask to describe what Amazon is, it's very tough to say what it is because the company has morphed. So much so, Jeff Bezos says every day is day zero for Amazon. The other one, which is also very interesting, is Microsoft, which was a very offline kind of player, but managed to go into cloud and very online and still morphing. So there are examples of companies who have also managed to stay ahead of the game. Correct? You can see Microsoft also playing a role in open AI, etc., etc. So there are interesting companies. So one of the things I want to follow on from this is, with all these kind of changes, okay, that are happening in technology, in this and the rapid pace of innovation, what has been the impact of recent technologies, and what are the issues that are arising because of this?
Very good question, Chandu. I think while we have been discussing some classic examples of companies that failed and technologies that got adopted and became very mainstream, and then technologies that were irrelevant, I think what is interesting for us to understand the recent growth of open AI's ChatGPT and how different companies adopted a strategy to adopt OpenAI's ChatGPT or come with a competitive approach on that. So if you take the OpenAI's ChatGPT in a matter of months, created some revolution where what was supposed to be a very niche technology on natural language processing and generative AI has become the mainstream, and most of us started to see how it can shape the content creation, the ability to write code, or even customer support. For years, we never thought a major alternative to Google can exist as a search engine. I recently have moved to a different mode of searching. I no longer use Google as the first protocol for search, but that has happened because the way the Google has been doing is to provide links to other contents that exist in the marketplace, and based on the ability of Google to index it and provide a relevant content, I go to the first 3 links that it actually shows. But having said that, Google has now started to look at how they can actually compete with the OpenAI's ChatGPT. But as Chandu said correctly, the question is whether I will compete directly with ChatGPT or whether I will adopt it and work with ChatGPT. The strategy that was adopted by Google was that they will actually compete directly against it, and they attempted that through Bard, and now with Gemini. Bard was a failure, and Gemini is actually having limited success. They are having both Gemini and the conventional search in the same page. But if you see Microsoft, it was very quick to integrate ChatGPT, placing them ahead of the curve, and they also made a substantial investment. And this means that Microsoft has, amongst other things, placed its bet on an emerging technology that now has made Bing a popular search engine, because ChatGPT's technology got integrated with Bing. And today, if you happen to use Bing, you will actually see much better results compared to how it was before. And of course, there are a lot of pitfalls of technology which I will talk about, but this is actually a bigger topic on its own. But I'll wait for Chandu to ask the next question.
So one thing which just to add to what Mahesh said, one of the things I was just reading is people are saying that AI is more for the youngsters and that the older folks have not much of a role to play. But in reality, if you look at it, today AI, actually, there are only few companies who build these LLMs, the large language models and the underlying, the data sets on which they are based. But the real value comes from the prompts that are given. And now they've seen that the quality prompts are not from youngsters. It is actually from the most seasoned pros who have domain expertise, who have experience. It's like, it's like the plumber comes to a house in the US and, what the house owner cannot find out where the leak is and, he tries for half an hour. The plumber comes and sorts it out in 1 minute. And then he charges $100. So this guy said, you took 1 minute, why are you charging $100? He says, because I know where to tap. So I think same thing is happening with respect to AI or these new technologies. I think the older guys, whoever you think is older here, actually don't have cause to fear. Because our old saying, Mahesh will bear me, a fool with a tool is still a fool. So I think it is useful for a lot of the people who are more seasoned not to get worried about these new technologies, but to actually see how they can adapt it. Now, Mahesh did talk about the ill effects of technologies. One of the things that Supreme Court Justice Gavai recently pointed out at a medical conference is, if you're using AI or you're using a robot to do a surgery and something goes wrong,